In 1944, London was bleeding, and our boys on the ground had no answer for Hitler's most terrifying weapon. But the Nazis missed one tiny detail, and it cost them everything. Hitler's V-1 buzz bomb was a technological marvel, but it wasn't defeated by a bigger bomb or a faster plane. It was defeated by a radio signal, packed into a shell the size of a beer bottle. The Nazis laughed at Allied electronics, calling their fuses toys. But those toys were about to turn the skies over England into a wall of steel, stopping 82% of the V-1s cold. It began with a sound unlike anything the people of London had ever heard before. This was 1944. The city had already endured the Blitz, the nightly terror from the Luftwaffe. They knew the sound of the big bombers, the heavy drone of the Heinkels and Dorniers. They knew the scream of a Stuka, though those were rare over England now. They knew the rhythm of their own anti-aircraft guns, the friendly, barking cough that meant someone was fighting back. But this was new. It was a sputtering, rhythmic pulse, a low, ragged growl that seemed to tear the air. Put, 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 put. It sounded, as many would later say, like a broken-down motorcycle, or perhaps a cheap motorboat. It wasn't a sound that should have been in the sky. It was unnatural. It was the sound of the V-1, the Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1. The Nazis called it the cherry stone. The Allies called it the doodlebug, or the buzz bomb. To the people of London, it was simply that thing. And the sound was the first layer of its terror. It was a weapon of psychology as much as physics. It would come in low and fast, too fast for many of the fighters, too low and erratic for the heavy guns. It didn't care about the weather. It flew in the rain, in the fog, by day and by night. And as it flew overhead, that ragged, pulsing roar would fill your entire world. You'd stop what you were doing. The milkman would pause, bottle in hand. The trolley conductor would stop, his hand on the brake. Everyone would look up, scanning the gray skies for the tiny, cigar-shaped menace. But the sound, as awful as it was, wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. The V-1 was a simple machine, brilliantly simple, really. It was powered by a pulse jet engine, a crude but effective piece of engineering that just gulped in air, mixed it with cheap, low-grade gasoline, ignited it, and blasted the exhaust out the back. It was a flying bomb. It didn't need a pilot. It didn't need a complex guidance system. It had a simple autopilot, a magnetic compass, and a little propeller on its nose. This little propeller wasn't for propulsion. It was a counter. Back at the launch site, in the dark forests of occupied France, a German crew would set this counter, let's say 99 rotations. As the V-1 flew, the air spinning this little prop, it would click down, 98, 97, all the way across the English Channel. When it hit zero, it did two things. It deployed a pair of spoilers to tip the bomb into a dive, and most terrifyingly, it cut the fuel. The engine stopped. The put-put-put was gone. And in that sudden, terrible silence, everyone on the ground knew. They had about 13 seconds. 13 seconds to find cover, to dive into a ditch, to crawl under a table, to whisper a prayer. The bomb was coming down, and nobody, not the man who launched it, nor the man about to die from it, knew exactly where it would land. It was a lottery of death, and it held the city in a grip of fear that the Blitz, for all its fire and fury, had never quite managed. The V-1 was impersonal. It was random. It was a machine. The first ones hit in June of 1944, just days after D-Day. It was Hitler's retaliation, a spiteful, desperate act to break the will of the British people while their armies were storming the beaches of Normandy. And it was working. The bombs were landing everywhere. a pub in Chelsea, killing 60 people, a shopping center in the middle of the day, a church during Sunday service. It was indiscriminate slaughter. The government tried to keep a stiff upper lip, of course. Reports were censored, but you can't censor the hole in the ground where your neighbor's house used to be. The problem for the Allies was immense. How do you stop a weapon like this? The first line of defense, the Royal Air Force, was struggling. The V-1 was fast, flying at nearly 400 miles per hour. Only the very fastest Allied fighters like the new Spitfire Mark 14 or the Tempest could even catch it. And when they did, it was suicide to shoot it down. A burst of cannon fire would detonate the 1-ton warhead and the explosion would obliterate the attacking plane. Pilots, brave men all, developed a new tactic. They would fly alongside the V-1, carefully, so carefully, and slide their own wingtip under the V-1's stubby wing. Then, with a gentle lift, they would tip the doodlebug, tumbling its simple gyroscope. The bomb, confused, would spiral out of control and crash into the empty countryside. Think about that. Think about the courage, the sheer, steady-handed skill to fly inches from a flying bomb at 400 miles per hour and nudge it like a pool cue.
But this was not a sustainable solution. It was too dangerous, and there were simply too many V-1s. Over 8,000 were launched at England. The pilots couldn't stop them all. So the burden fell to the second line of defense, the anti-aircraft guns, the ACAC crews. These were the men of the Anti-Aircraft Command, stationed in a huge belt along the coast. Their job was to shoot the V-1s down before they ever reached London, and they were failing, utterly. It wasn't for lack of trying. They had the guns. They had the new American-made radar. They could see the targets. They could track them, but they couldn't hit them. A V-1 was a tiny target, moving incredibly fast. A heavy anti-aircraft gun, the big 3.7-inch models, fired a shell that weighed nearly 30 pounds. To hit a target, you had to lead it, just like in duck hunting. You had to calculate its speed, its altitude, its direction, and then fire your shell not at it, but where it was going to be. And that's where the real problem lay: the fuse. For 40 years, artillery fuses had been, essentially, glorified clockwork. You would set a timer on the shell, explode in 15 seconds. You'd fire it, and 15 seconds later, it would burst. You hoped, you prayed that your calculations were right and that the shell and the target would arrive at the same piece of sky at the same moment. But against the V-1, it was hopeless. The calculations were too complex, the target too fast. The gun crews were firing thousands upon thousands of shells for every single hit. Some reports said it took over 20,000 shells to down just one V-1. The sky was full of black puffs of smoke, almost all of them in the wrong place. London was still bleeding. The Nazis knew this. They knew the limitations of Allied technology. They had their own radar, of course. They had their own timed fuses, but they had poured their resources into offensive weapons, into jets and rockets. They had a certain arrogance, a technological hubris. They believed their V-1 was unstoppable. They had seen reports of Allied experiments with electronic fuses, strange ideas about using radio waves, and they belittled them. They laughed. German intelligence reports from the time dismissed these concepts as toys, as fantasies that were too complex, too fragile to ever work in the hellish environment of a spinning, superheated artillery shell. They believed the Allies were wasting their time. They were wrong, and this single, arrogant miscalculation would prove to be one of the most decisive of the entire war. Because the Allies weren't just experimenting, they had solved it. They had built the toy, and it was about to change everything. The story of this toy doesn't start in England. It starts in America, in Washington, D.C., even before Pearl Harbor. In 1940, a brilliant physicist named Merle Tuve, a man whose name should be as famous as Oppenheimer's, went to the government. He was the head of a small group of scientists, and they had a radical idea. Tuve was a big-picture thinker. He saw the war in Europe, and he knew America would be dragged in. He also knew that conventional anti-aircraft fire was, to put it mildly, dreadfully inefficient. He had seen the numbers. It was like trying to hit a fly with a rifle bullet from a mile away. The problem, he argued, wasn't the gun. It was the fuse. The timed fuse was a relic. It was a guess. What was needed, he said, was a fuse with a brain. A fuse that didn't need to be told when to explode. A fuse that could see its target. But how? How do you give eyes to a piece of steel? The idea they proposed was simple in concept and absolutely mind-bogglingly impossible in practice. They wanted to build a tiny radio station, a transmitter and a receiver, and pack it into the nose of an artillery shell. Here's how it was supposed to work. The transmitter would send out a continuous radio wave. As the shell flew, these waves would bounce off everything: clouds, the ground, and, if you were lucky, an enemy airplane. When the wave bounced off the plane, it would reflect back to the receiver in the fuse. Because the shell was moving toward the plane, the returning wave would be compressed. It's called the Doppler effect. It's the same reason a train whistle sounds higher pitched as it comes towards you and lower as it goes away. The fuse's tiny receiver would detect this specific, compressed, Dopplered signal. This signal would then be fed into an amplifier, making it stronger. And when that signal became strong enough, meaning the shell was just about to fly by the plane, it would flip a switch. That switch would detonate the main charge. The shell wouldn't hit the target. It wouldn't need to. It would explode next to it, showering it with thousands of pieces of red-hot shrapnel. The kill zone of a single shell would increase from a few feet to over 100 feet. It would turn a rifle bullet into a shotgun blast.
The government, to their immense credit, saw the potential. They gave Tuve a small team, a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, and a blank check. They called it Section T. Their official cover was Proximity Fuse Development. Now, we have to stop and appreciate the scale of this challenge. This is 1940. The first programmable computer has not been built. The transistor has not been invented. The world runs on vacuum tubes. A vacuum tube, as many of you will remember, is a delicate thing. It's a glass bulb with fragile filaments and grids inside. Your grandmother's old console radio had them. They were the size of a light bulb. They were fragile, and they burned out. Tuve and his team needed to build a complete radio transmitter and receiver with multiple vacuum tubes that could fit inside a fuse the size of a pint of milk. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was that this entire, delicate contraption had to survive being fired out of a cannon. The team calculated the forces. When a 5-inch naval shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to over 2,000 miles per hour in less than a foot. The force, the G-force, is estimated to be 20,000 times the force of gravity. If you weighed 200 pounds, you would momentarily weigh 4 million pounds. A normal vacuum tube, made of glass and fine wire, would be crushed into dust. The battery needed to power it would be flattened into a metal pancake. The capacitors would shred. The wiring would snap. This wasn't an engineering problem. This was a violation of physics as they knew it. The team, which grew from a handful of men to over 100, was stumped. For months, they tried everything. They tried packing the tubes in sawdust. They failed. They tried suspending them in jelly. They failed. The project was on the verge of collapse. The military was getting impatient. And then came the breakthrough. A young engineer on the team, a man named James Van Allen, who would later become famous for discovering the Van Allen radiation belts around the Earth, had an idea. What if the problem wasn't the glass? What if it was the shape? They were using normal tubes shaped like light bulbs. They were weak. So they designed a new kind of tube. It was tiny, the size of a peanut, and it was rugged.
They did away with the glass bulb and potted the internal components directly into a tiny ceramic cylinder. They made the filaments thicker, bracing them against the shock. They called it the rugged tube. They built a prototype. They put it in a test shell. They loaded it into a cannon and fired it straight into a steel plate. Then they dug the shattered remains of the shell out of the plate, and they found the tube. It was intact. It still worked. That was the first miracle, but it wasn't the last. They still needed a battery. A normal battery would be destroyed by the launch. So they invented a new one. It was a battery that was stored dry. The components, zinc, carbon, and a chemical electrolyte, were separate. But the electrolyte was stored in a glass vial. When the gun was fired, the G-force would shatter the vial, the liquid would soak the components, and the battery would come to life. It wouldn't even be a battery until the moment it was fired. They needed a safety switch. What if the shell's radio detected the ground or a friendly ship? It had to be armed after it was safely away from the gun. So they built a switch based on mercury. A small amount of mercury was held in a chamber. When the shell was fired, the G-force would push the mercury back. But as the shell spun, the centrifugal force would slowly force the mercury through a tiny, porous filter. It took about half a second. When the mercury finally reached the other side, it completed the circuit. The fuse was armed. One by one, they solved a dozen problems that before Section T were considered unsolvable. They built this impossible device. By 1942, they had a working prototype. They called it the VT Fuze for variable time. The secrecy around this project was absolute. It was considered at the time more important than the Manhattan Project. Why? Because the atomic bomb was a strategic weapon. It could end the war, perhaps. But the VT fuse was a tactical weapon. If the Germans or the Japanese got their hands on it, if they captured a dud and reverse-engineered it, they could use it in their own anti-aircraft guns. And Allied bombing raids over Germany, the entire D-Day invasion, would become impossible. Our air forces would be swept from the sky. So a rule was made. The fuse could only be used over water, where any dud would sink to the bottom of the ocean, lost forever. The first test came in January 1943 in the Pacific. The cruiser USS Helena was part of a task force. A Japanese dive bomber, a Val, came screaming down at the ship. The Helena's 5-inch guns opened up, firing the new VT fuses. The gunners, used to the old timed fuses, watched, not expecting much.
The first shell missed. The second shell exploded. The Japanese plane, which wasn't even hit directly, simply disintegrated in midair, shredded by a cloud of shrapnel. The gunnery officer on the Helena was stunned. He sent a message back to Washington that was just 3 words. A new era of naval gunnery is born. Over the next year, the VT fuse changed the war in the Pacific. The terrifying Japanese kamikaze attacks, which had been so effective, were now being blunted. Ships that were once defenseless were now bristling with guns that could not miss. The fuses were working. But the rule remained: over water only. And then came June 1944 and the V-1. Back in England, the situation was desperate. The RAF couldn't stop them. The gunners on the coast were firing 20,000 rounds for every kill. London was in a panic. The government was seriously considering a mass evacuation of the entire city. Churchill was getting frantic reports. His generals told him the only way to stop the V-1s was to overrun the launch sites in France. But that would take weeks, maybe months. London didn't have months. General Frederick Pyle, the head of Anti-Aircraft Command, knew about the VT fuse. He had been begging for it. He argued that the V-1s were flying over the empty fields and marshes of the coast. If a dud fell, it would fall in mud, not in German hands. The risk was minimal, he said, and the reward was the survival of London. In Washington, the debate was intense. The secret was too valuable. But the pressure from Churchill was unbearable. Finally, a compromise was reached. A small, select shipment of the new VT fuses would be flown to England. They would be given only to the American anti-aircraft batteries that had just arrived after D-Day. They were to be used under the strictest supervision. The fuses arrived. The American gun crews were briefed. They were told this was the most important piece of tech they would ever touch. They were given a new predictor, a new radar, and these new magic shells. They were moved to the coast, forming a line codenamed Operation Diver. The British crews, still using their old timed fuses, watched with suspicion. They had seen wonder weapons before. They didn't believe it. A V-1 was picked up on radar. It was coming in hot, heading straight for the American sector. The radar locked on. The new predictor, an early analog computer, whirred and clicked, feeding the calculations to the guns. The guns swung, leading the target. Fire! The shell leaped from the barrel. It screamed into the sky. And then, just as it seemed it would miss, just as it drew level with the V-1, a flash. A perfect, bright orange flash. The V-1's wing was sheared off. It tumbled, end over end, and exploded harmlessly in the marshes. There was a moment of stunned silence from the gun crews. Then a roar. They had done it. This was the start. At first, the results were good. The kill rate for the guns on the coast, which had been near zero, jumped. It climbed to 17%. That meant 17 out of every 100 doodlebugs were being shot down. It was better than nothing, but it wasn't enough. General Pyle saw the problem. The American crews were new. His British crews, the ones who had been fighting for 4 years, were the real experts. But they didn't have the fuses. He made a decision that was, in the bureaucratic world of the military, an act of rebellion. He ordered the fuses to be shared with his British crews immediately. Now the real battle began. The veteran British gunners, armed with the American radar, the American predictor, and the American fuse, went to work. The effect was not gradual. It was immediate, and it was devastating. The V-1s came over, and the guns met them. But now, the shells weren't just puffing harmlessly behind the target, they were exploding on it. 1 shell, 1 kill. 2 shells, 1 kill. The sky over the English coast became a wall of steel. Let's look at the numbers because they tell the real story. In the first week of Operation Diver, with the old fuses, the guns shot down 79 V-1s. In the second week, with the new fuses just starting to arrive, they shot down 189. In the third week, as more crews got the fuses, they shot down 650. And in the final week of August 1944, the gunners of Anti-Aircraft Command shot down 1,363 V-1s. The kill rate climbed from 17% to 24%, then to 40%, then to 60%. In the last desperate week of the V-1 assault, the gunners were hitting 82% of all V-1s that entered their sector. 82%. It was a massacre. In Germany, the High Command was in chaos. Their wonder weapon was failing. The reports from their spies in England were confusing. They said the guns were impossibly accurate. Goebbels in his diary blamed the failure on faulty manufacturing. Hitler blamed his generals. The one thing they never suspected, not until it was far too late, was that the Allies' toy fuse was real. They had belittled the idea so completely that it never entered their calculations. Their own arrogance had blinded them.
For the people of London, the change was a miracle. The nightly terror began to subside. They would still hear the put-put-put in the distance, but then they would hear the reassuring, thunderous barrage from the coast, and, more often than not, the put-put-put would stop, followed by a distant crump. Another one gone. By September, the V-1 campaign was effectively over. The guns had broken its back. The Allied armies, advancing from Normandy, finally overran the launch sites. The threat was gone. It is not an exaggeration to say that this one small device, the proximity fuse, saved London. But the story of the fuse doesn't end there.
It had proven itself over water. It had proven itself against the V-1, but the original rule still stood. Never use it over land in Europe. The secret was still too vital. And so, hundreds of thousands of these shells sat in crates in England. Forbidden. Then came December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler, in one last monumental gamble, had thrown all his reserves into a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. The weather was terrible. It was snowing, and a thick fog covered the battlefield. This was crucial because it grounded the Allied air forces. Without air support, the American divisions on the ground, men from the 101st Airborne, the 28th Infantry, were isolated, outnumbered, and fighting for their lives. The German advance was terrifyingly effective, and they had a new brutal tactic. Their artillery was devastating. They would wait for the Americans to dig in, then pound their positions with massive coordinated bombardments. In Washington, the generals were desperate. They needed something to stop the German infantry. An Army ordnance officer, who knew about the fuses sitting in England, had a thought. The fuse was designed to explode near a plane in the air. What if you used it against soldiers on the ground? He ran the calculations. If you fired the shell at a low angle, the fuse's radio wave would see the ground approaching. You could set it to detonate not on impact, which would just make a deep crater, but about 30 feet above the ground. An airburst. An airburst shell is the most terrifying thing an infantryman can face. A normal shell exploding on the ground sends its shrapnel up and out. If you are in a foxhole, you are relatively safe. But an airburst explodes above you. It rains down thousands of pieces of shrapnel into every foxhole, every ditch, every slit trench. There is no cover. There is no escape. The order was given. On Christmas Eve, 1944, the ban was lifted. The fuses were rushed to the front. The American artillery crews, under siege and freezing in the snow, were given the new shells. They were told to aim not at the German tanks, but at the infantry, at the tree lines where the German assaults were massing. On Christmas Day, the Germans prepared for another massive attack. They gathered in the forests, thousands of men ready to charge, and then the American guns opened up. But instead of the usual crashes and thuds, the German soldiers heard a new sound, a terrifying, screaming whistle, followed by a string of cracks right over their heads. It was as if the sky itself was exploding. The VT fuses, bursting in the air, saturated the German positions with a storm of steel. The effect was indescribable. Whole companies were wiped out in seconds. Men who thought they were safe in their foxholes were killed without ever seeing the enemy. German prisoners captured later were in a state of shock. They called it magic. They said the Americans had a new terrifying weapon that was a lightning bolt from the sky. They had never seen anything like it. The German offensive, which had been so powerful, faltered and then broke. The Battle of the Bulge was won, and the Christmas miracle of the VT fuse was a massive, if secret, part of that victory.
Only then, in the final months of the war, did the Germans capture a dud. Their scientists took it apart, and their arrogance turned to horror. They realized, far too late, what the Allies had done. They saw the tiny, rugged tubes. They saw the ingenious battery. They saw the mercury switch. And they knew, in that moment, that they had not just been outfought, they had been outthought. The chief of German electronics research, when he saw the fuse, reportedly said, "I have seen this in our own proposals, but I always said it was a toy. I was wrong." That's the story of the fuse. But the impact goes so much further. The V-1 was just the beginning. The proximity fuse changed warfare forever. It was the first smart weapon. It was the first time a weapon had a brain, a sensor, and could make its own decision. After the war, the technology from Section T didn't just go into a museum. It exploded into the civilian world. That effort to miniaturize vacuum tubes, to make them rugged and reliable, that was the first step toward the miniaturization of all electronics. The men who worked at Section T went on to become the pioneers of the new electronic age. James Van Allen used the principles he developed for the fuse to build the instruments for America's first satellites. The techniques for building rugged circuits became the foundation for the transistor and then the microchip. Every time you use a cell phone, you are using the distant descendant of a tiny radio transmitter that was once fired out of a cannon. Every guided missile, every radar system, and yes, even the automatic door at your grocery store owes a small debt to Merle Tuve and his team. We often remember the big moments of the war. We remember D-Day. We remember the atom bomb. We remember the generals like Patton and Eisenhower. But we often forget the quiet, desperate battles fought not in the trenches, but in the laboratories. The war was also won by men with slide rules, soldering irons, and ideas that seemed impossible. The German V-1 was a weapon of brute force and terror. The proximity fuse was a weapon of intelligence. It was a scalpel. And in that duel over the skies of London in 1944, the scalpel beat the sledgehammer. The toy that the Nazis belittled proved to be the war winner they never saw coming. This history is so important, and we believe in digging up these details that get lost to time. If this is the kind of history you appreciate, the kind of history that makes you think, we'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing. It just lets us know we're on the right track and that these stories still matter. Now, think about the men who did this. Over 100,000 people eventually worked on the Fuse project in total secrecy. They couldn't tell their wives, their families, their friends. They worked day and night, knowing that what they were building could save their country. Many of them were young, just out of college. They were given a problem that the greatest minds in Germany, a nation famed for its engineering, had declared impossible. And they solved it. They solved it not with a single eureka moment, but with 1,000 small victories. A new way to draw a wire, a new way to pot a tube in ceramic, a new chemical for a battery. It was a victory of persistence. It was a victory of what we used to call Yankee ingenuity. It's amazing what they accomplished with slide rules and sheer willpower, isn't it? That kind of grit seems to be in short supply sometimes. Let us know in the comments what other piece of lost World War II tech you'd like us to cover. We read all of them, and it gives us great ideas for the next story. The German V-1 program was in itself a tragedy of misused genius. The engineers who designed the pulse jet were brilliant, but their brilliance was chained to a cause of pure evil, and their weapon was one of pure, indiscriminate terror. It had no military objective other than to kill civilians and break morale. It was, in the end, a failure. But the proximity fuse, that was different. It was a defensive weapon. It was built to protect. It protected the fleet in the Pacific from kamikazes. It protected London from the V-1s. And it protected the infantrymen in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. It's a powerful reminder that technology itself isn't good or evil. It's a tool. And the morality of that tool comes from the hands that wield it. When the war was finally over, the full story could be told. General George S. Patton, a man who was not easily impressed by technology, he was a cavalryman at heart, was given a demonstration of the fuse's effect on ground troops. After seeing the simulated airbursts, he was silent for a long time. He then said, "The proximity fuse. With this, we could have won the war a year earlier." A year earlier. Think of the lives that would have been saved. The V-1, the buzz bomb, is now a museum piece. It's a relic of a dark time. But the toy that defeated it is everywhere. It's in the phone in your pocket. It's in the satellites orbiting overhead. It's in the medical devices that keep us healthy. The legacy of the V-1 is rubble and fear. The legacy of the proximity fuse is the modern world. It's a story worth remembering. It's a testament to the quiet, unglamorous work, the persistence, and the belief that no problem is truly impossible. When the Nazis belittled Allied fuse technology, they weren't just making a technical mistake. They were underestimating the resolve of free people to defend their homes. And that was the last mistake many of them ever made. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a piece of history that truly changed the world, hitting that like button does more than you know. It tells the folks who run this platform that this history still matters, and it helps us bring the next story to you. We've covered a lot of ground today, and we hope this was as fascinating for you as it was for us to research. We'll be back next week with another story, another piece of history that you might not know. Until then, if you'd like to see another story just like this one, we've picked out a video about the secret American pilots who flew German jets. Let us know in the comment box. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.